This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
I have to begin by saying I'm delighted to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation with each of you. And it's nice to see a number of colleagues and friends who I've known through the years. This is an opportunity to sort of lay out for you the four big ideas that we've sort of coalesced around in our Carnegie study about the future of medical education. So that's why I'm excited about the opportunity to engage in dialogue about this. I have to say that in my now almost 4 decades of work in medical education, that I've never seen a time like this, in the sense that every single organization in the House of Medicine is saying, can't we do this better? It doesn't make any difference whether it's the AAMC, the AMA, the NBME, RRCs, you name the alphabet soup, but they're all saying, we've got to think this again, and we've got to do it better, probably thinking it through in a new way that allows us to be more efficient in terms of the learning approach to this, given the fact that we're more and more compressed on the time end of things. So with that as background, this is what I'm going to do. Where is it? Have I got the right side? Whoop! Oh, I did. I got it. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is describe a bit about where we've come from. It's striking to me that the framework within which we work in medical education was set at least 100 years ago. And so I want to describe a little bit about the Flexner Report. After all, Abraham Flexner was one of the first people to do the kind of national survey work that we're doing again, and it is, in a sense, in his honor that we are doing it. So at the foundation, we genuflect before his picture each time we go by. So I want to share with you just a snapshot of that. And then to suggest that obviously things have changed dramatically in the past 100 years, and talk about a few of those sort of tidal wave things. So that will bring us to the current study and where we are today. The majority of the time, though, I want to talk about our 4 big ideas in medical education. So this is good old Abe. He, of course, was not a physician. His brother was at Hopkins, but he was a schoolmaster. And he was hired in part at the request of the Council on Medical Education by the AMA, who recognized that they had a huge problem with the quality of medical education at the time, but, as is true today, were incapable of addressing it internally because of all of the conflicting self-interests that were at work there. So what Flexner said was, in looking around, and he actually had a wonderful template in Hopkins and a few other major medical schools at that point, was that to be a quality physician required a university education. And what you may not know is that I believe it was Hopkins that was the first university to require, first medical school to require graduating from college, not high school, but college. Preceded Harvard, preceded most of the other schools. And they, in fact, weren't sure they were going to make it when they did that. After all, why would you want to go through college when you could get right into medical school out of high school? So he was saying that the important thing is here that you need to be immersed in a culture of inquiry and discovery. That if you want physicians to be the kind and quality that we expect, you've got to do that. So he, like many others at the time, recommended a 2+2 curriculum. 2 years of basic science, immersion in the laboratory and in the experience of the sciences essential to medicine, and then 2 years of clinical experience after being trained to think like a scientist, to apply that at the bedside, and to do so with faculty who were going from the laboratory to the bedside and back again. Sounds very much like clinical translational research. So the other thing to keep in mind is there were no residencies, there were no fellowships, there was no certification, there was no accreditation, there was nothing. So you could be a mom and pop operation, which of course was part of the problem. And he also was very much in the sort of progressive educational movement in terms of recommending laboratory and clinical experience, namely active learning processes. So in many respects, you can see that's a pretty close template to what we have today. Medical schools are all in universities. Most of them have teaching hospitals, and the curriculum is pretty much 2+2. Now, we're morphing that, obviously, but the basic outline remains the same. So what's happened in the past 100 years, and in particular, what has sort of swept over us in the past 10 to 20 years? And the first thing, of course, is just the incredible explosion of biomedical knowledge. And as a result of that, you have to know more and more, and therefore have to know it in a less and less environment. And so you end up going deep, and the analog of that explosion is the subspecialization within every discipline. I think somebody was saying about 20 years ago there were 20 specialties in medicine. Now there are over 200 if you count all the fellowships. And every year it continues to expand. In fact, as somebody said, when you get two guys together, they say, oh, let's have a fellowship, and a new one is born, left-handed, whatever it is. The concomitant to that sort of narrowing focus is the requirement to actually think broader, and thus developing interdisciplinary approaches to research. It's very unusual these days to have one discipline engaged in a serious research effort. It really takes multiple specialties. The second thing is that teaching hospitals have really been transformed. In Flexner's day, people were in there forever. Well, not quite, but for long periods of time. There was no great rush. People spent a lot of time learning on a few number of patients. Very relaxed environment. That is, of course, totally changed. And the rapid pace, the rapid throughput, the requirement to be cost competitive means that, for the most part, education has been squeezed out of most of the teaching hospitals. In fact, I'm shocked at my own hospital at how bad it's gotten just in the past 5 years or so. And as a result, from a learning perspective, you don't see the common, and you certainly don't see chronic illness in the context of inpatient services in hospitals. So what am I doing? You're running out of gas?
No, you're fine.
Oh, okay.
I was just trying to get to the internet.
All right. So what's happening there is that the teaching hospital environment is no longer a good learning environment for medical students, and actually not for interns either. It's fabulous for fellows. It's really good for high-end residents, but the basic function of a teaching hospital is kind of going by the boards at the most basic level. The next thing that has happened is this incredible expansion in curriculum. As the knowledge expands, the requirement to cover more in less time is there. As we talked about, the expansion of residencies, the expansion of fellowships, all of which is reflective of this knowledge expansion. And finally, one of the things I have been a strong national advocate for is changing USMLE. And one of the reasons for that is that it really reflects the old Flexnerian model, not the contemporary reality. So think about it. If you have a 2+2 curriculum, you need to test at the end of each of those 2 periods. Well, Stanford's curriculum, UCSF's curriculum, everybody has gone interdisciplinary and increased the amount of clinical experience in the first 2 years. It doesn't reflect those exams anymore. So get rid of step 1, that's what they're going to do. Keep step 2, because you need something to certify licensure for supervised practice. You really don't need step 3, because in the old model, up until probably 20 years ago, you could be a GP if you just had 1 year of internship, and that's why you have that exam. Unsupervised practice. Nobody does that anymore, so why not leave it to the certifying exams? So I won on the first one, I lost on the second one to the state licensing boards, but this gives us a huge opportunity to rethink the way in which we do undergraduate medical education. Now, my faculty tell me that they will retire or quit if I try to do my next dream change. And Neil, you would have the same problem after the heavy lifting we've both done in terms of changing our curriculums in recent years. But I think it's time to rethink once again, and I'll show you what that is going to look like. So that brings us to our Carnegie study. Lee Shulman had a sort of a dream of saying, couldn't we redo all of those fabulous studies of preparation for the professions that Flexner and others did in the first years of the Carnegie Foundation. It was founded in 1906, so the first study that they really did was Flexner's in 1908 that came out in 1910. The first wave of these cross-comparison studies were done for the clergy, lawyers, and engineers. The second wave is nursing and medicine. The clergy book is out. All of these will result in books. They're all published by Josie Bass. The clergy's out, the law is out, engineers and press, and nursing and medicine, we're each still writing. We were supposed to be done a year ago. I'll be lucky if I get this thing drafted this year, but we anticipate it'll be published in '09. As part of our study in medicine, we site visited 14 medical schools. In fact, we asked Neil if we could come look at Stanford as our pilot to test out our stuff, and you were engaged in that pesky LCME thing at the time and said this would not be a good time, and I knew exactly, so we did it at UCSF. But we looked at a variety of medical schools around the country and 2 academic medical centers as well. Before each of them, we did about a dozen interviews. While we were there for 3 days, we did 104 focus groups and over 100 observations. The focus of our study was not on the basic science instruction, because there's been a huge amount of investment and energy put into that. It really is the clinical. And one of the issues was, should we look just at UME or should we look at UME and GME? And we said, well, you can't understand UME in the clinical if you don't understand GME, so we took on those. And after we did that, then what we did was we kind of have immersed ourselves in the learning sciences and have been trying to read everything we could, not only in medical education, but in education and learning and cognitive research generally. So on the basis of that, we have begun writing. Molly Cook and Bridget O'Brien are my 2 colleagues in this, and so to start with, I think it's important just to keep in mind the obvious, which is that our mission is to produce knowledgeable, skillful, compassionate physicians who are committed, body and soul and mind, to the relentless pursuit of excellence in medicine, to continuously advancing the field. What we don't want is people who get out of here and look 20 years out into practice exactly like they looked when they graduated. And the more we looked at surgery in particular, that would be really bad for one's future careers, since surgery doesn't look anything like it did when most people graduated, or OBGYN, I might add. I want to tell you a little story that illustrates part of the process of how learning occurs, and it comes from some interviews I did a couple of weeks ago with some chief residents in radiology. The reason for the radiology is that I was giving this address to the Association of University Radiologists last week, and I thought it'd be nice to know what radiologists do. So I was taken around and did some observations and interviewed some chief residents. And one of them, when I asked to tell me a powerful learning experience, reflected back to her first year as a radiology resident. And what you need to understand is that in about the first of all, they have their preliminary internship, and then they come into radiology. And in the first 6 months, they rotate through a whole bunch of subspecialty rotations so that after 6 months, they can take call independently. So she was describing her first experience at San Francisco General Hospital, our county hospital. And she was really, really hoping, given the fact that she was alone, that it would be a relatively light night. But of course, that would never, right, Veronica, could never be the case at SFGH. Okay, so all of a sudden, in comes this, as she says, nasty auto accident victim who was really in bad shape. And so they go through and they do the images, and she's sitting there with her PACS image reviewers there, waiting for these images to come up on this patient. And as they're slowly coming up and she's beginning to do the reading, in walks the whole team, the whole trauma team, all 10 of them. And she's particularly upset about this because the trauma surgeon, who's really big and can be perceived as really gruff, although he's a teddy bear inside, had a reputation of being a surgeon, if you know what I mean. And so she was worried about this, with him sitting over her shoulder with 9 other people, all in this little place waiting for her to read the images that were coming off the slides. And so she did what she was trained to do. She sat down and she said, okay, let's look at the spleen. And so she pulls it up and sort of, it was very interesting how they scroll back and forth and look up and down those MRIs. And begins to stage it and interpret it. And much to her surprise, the trauma surgeon, who happens to be Andre Campbell, sat down next to her and began to talk about how her staging of the spleen or the kidney or whatever the organ was that they were looking at would influence what he and the trauma team would do in surgery. So all of a sudden, the lights went on. Oh, I get it. Now I see how I'm connected, and what I bring to this impacts the patient and the team that's working on that. So reflecting back on that, 4 years later, that incident comes to mind for her in terms of a very powerful source of learning. It also influenced her identity as a radiologist in terms of seeing what her role was, and the fact that she really needed to be committed heart and soul to doing the very best job because it had immediate ramifications on the patient. Powerful identity formation process. So that's sort of a background story to what we're going to hear. What we want to be able to think about and how we want to frame our study is to think about the fact that we're about formation. And we take that actually from the clergy study in terms of creating habits of mind and habits of heart, the aspirations and commitments as well as the knowledge that is required for it. We want habits of knowledge which allow the learner to integrate knowledge and experience, the two critical things that have to go together in order to diagnose and treat. It also means that they need to be able to integrate the many different roles and responsibilities that physicians perform, from clinician to advocate to policy analyst to quality improvement, the varying roles that are responsible for the physician to perform. And that each person who comes through training develops a specialized form of knowledge. No one of us is the same, and we want to encourage that kind of specialization of focus, energy, and commitment. Those are the habits of the mind. And we want them as habits because we want them to be automatic in the sense of no matter what's happening, that's the typical way that we approach the patient. But we also want more than that. We want to form habits of the heart. Namely, we want them to pursue, sort of in a hardwired-in fashion, excellence in improving health and health care. And we want that to shape the net result of this, their identity as a physician committed to excellence. So that's the context in which we're imagining our study. So now what are those 4 big ideas that we're sort of clustering our thinking around? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you each of these individually, tell you what's the sort of learning sciences background for this. What's the rationale? Why do we think this is an important thing? And then give you some illustrative examples of some of the strategies that people are already adopting to try to deal with each of these ideas. Because we believe that what the future is calling us to is actually resident in a lot of the innovation that's going on nationally. So it's sort of understanding that, tapping into it, and then enlarging it in meaningful ways. So the first one, in fact, this should be no surprise in terms of all of our work on integrated curriculum, is integration. That is the ability to connect multiple forms of knowledge and reasoning as well as roles and to be able to use that in service to our patients. The second is individualization. It is the recognition that each person is unique and distinctive and that they can develop their core area of unique form of expertise and that they ought to have a somewhat unique pathway through the learning experience that acknowledges their differing speed at which they achieve expertise. The third, if you haven't guessed already, is insistence upon excellence. It is a commitment to pursue excellence and to advance the field. And your areas of scholarship is absolutely on the mark with this area. And the final piece is sort of the result of this, which is identity formation. It is shaping the identity of the physician so that they embody these capacities and these commitments. So let's take a look at each of these. First one is integration. And one of the exciting pieces that comes out of the cognitive research related to physician knowledge and reasoning and is more broadly applicable or consistent with, I should say, reasoning of expertise generally, is that it is not enough to learn formal knowledge, and it is not enough to just have clinical experience in lots and lots of cases. The key is connecting the two. And we know from some preliminary research that how you frame something influences the way you see it, but also the number of cases you see develops the pattern recognition that helps you to connect with the basics. So we need both formal codified knowledge and we need a stronger emphasis early on experiential, contextual, practical knowledge. The second piece of it is that we need to acknowledge and recognize that it's not just analytical knowledge that we're after. It's not what are the 39 causes of a heart failure. Rather, it is the combination of that in relationship to the automatic pattern recognition. So people have estimated that probably 70–80% of most of the things that physicians see, if they've had lots of experience, is here. It's automatic pattern recognition. It is not rational analytic problem solving, except as you go back and say, is that right? What else could be there? And if it's complex and difficult, then there's a lot of this that goes on. One of the things that we never talk about is this, which is creative, imaginative, adaptive thinking and reasoning. And if you think about a quality improvement thing, there's no right way to do this. And usually there's not any really rational reason for why we currently do it, but it's the creative idea, sort of putting something strange together with something else, that allows you to think through a new way of doing things. And it's that creative, imaginative work that is so critical to advancing any field of inquiry and endeavor. And finally, not only are we interested in the ability to integrate and move back and forth between these cognitive functions, but also physicians play, as I mentioned already, multiple roles. And each of those needs to be part of the repertoire of experiences and capabilities that we expect of our physicians. Healer, listener, innovator, discoverer, leader, we need all of them. All right, so let's talk about courses and clerkships on the UME side, and I want to just briefly mention 3 things here, and then I'm going to illustrate each of those in more depth. The first is that almost all medical schools in the US now have done what our 2 schools have done, which is we've changed from a disciplinary-based curriculum to an integrated one in the first 2 years. And we've also brought more clinical experience into the first 2 years. Most of us have failed bringing the basic sciences through to the 3rd and 4th years, but nonetheless, we've begun to think about that. What we are recommending is that there be a better balance and that we think across 4 years, not 2 + 2. So we blow that up, we throw it out, we've been moving that direction, now let's radically move it to the next phase. This is the one where my faculty are going to retire on me. Let's think outside the box, let's use that creative thinking juices again, and imagine what it might be like to have a 4-year curriculum where you start people in clinical immersion, and then you run in a parallel track throughout those 4 years, both the formal knowledge and the clinical experience. Would look very different, and I'm going to show you how that might look. The second piece is that just as we had to take the curriculum away from the departments and integrate them centrally, we need to do the same thing with the clerkships. In fact, the problem's even worse in the clinical environment because it is totally captive to the surface demands of the particular discipline. And whatever happens to be there is whatever that curriculum is. There are some very exciting programs going on that have a totally different model and that get out of the predominantly inpatient-oriented, discipline-specific, endless rotation flight pattern and create a year-long integrated, patient-centered panel of patients for those students and preceptors to take that 3rd year. So I'm going to show you what that looks like, since most people can't even imagine. I couldn't imagine it when I first heard about it. And the third thing, which I'm not going to deal with, but I wanted to mention in passing, is that we need to think a new thought about assessment as well. That we cannot just focus on the knowledge, because that is not enough. We need portfolios, we need other mechanisms for documenting the range of competencies, skills, and abilities that we expect. And we've got to do that in a much better fashion that includes mentoring and other capacities that help. And not just UME. This needs to be UME and GME together. There ought to be a continuum. You ought to take it with you when you go. It builds continuously. But I don't have time to talk about that, so just put that as a placeholder to think about. Let me talk first about the clerkship and then come back to the curriculum, because I've been thinking about how you could actually connect these. The oldest one of these, as far as I can tell, is at the University of South Dakota, where they have sent students there to Yankton Community Multi-Specialty Practice. And it's not a clerkship in the classic sense. They are immersed in that multi-specialty practice. It is patient-centered, and they go where the patients go. The one that's gotten the biggest press for this is Cambridge Hospital at Harvard. And it's interesting that most of these tend to be rural or community-based because you can never get the Mass General or Brigham and Women's or Parnassus, UCSF, or Stanford Medical Center to do it at the home ship. the most resistant. Now think about that one as a statement of where we are in terms of what an academic medical center ought to be about. But having said that,
Is this Cambridge, England?
no, Cambridge, Massachusetts.
They
Yeah.
are medical school.
It's a Harvard rotation. No, it's their core integrated third year. They spend the entire third year in that hospital. Now, what they've done is the other ones, Mass General, Brigham and Women, Deaconess, BI, have adopted the 1 year period. So one of the ways you stop the discontinuity problem is you at least keep them in the same facility for 1 year. That actually helps immensely. But this is radical. And in fact, when I gave my talk to the radiologist on Friday, first somebody from Cambridge got up and said, "Thank you for highlighting our program. This is wonderful." Right after it gets up, "I'm from Mass General, and I want you to know this is not Harvard's program." I said, "Yes, I knew that. It is Harvard's program, but it is not what the other hospitals are doing. Yes, I know that." They have a classic format with some longitudinal things that run through it, which we're playing with at both VA and San Francisco General as well. But what this looks like is that you take the teaching away from the house staff and bring it back to the faculty for the 7 core disciplines that you would expect the rotations to go through on the inpatient services in the third year clerkships. You put them into the clinics in those specialties for a half day each, and then you rotate by week in terms of which ones are there. And so there, and the fact that they have rotations in the emergency department and in the urgent care centers, they pick up a panel of patients, which ranges someplace between 50 and 100 patients each. And they then follow them wherever they go. And so we had to modify the pager system. In fact, our students who are in this program now have pagers that is the MV, actually the house staff and the faculty who don't have it, which is that when any time their panel of patients enters the system in any clinic, ED, inpatient, they're automatically paged. So these empty slots are the times when they can follow that patient through to a clinic experience. And you wouldn't believe how much students learn in that process, nor the positive impact this thing has on the patients. So I shouldn't digress this far, but I can't help myself. I got an unsolicited phone call from a surgeon at Mount Zion who had just seen one of the students' patients who'd been referred from the internal medicine clinic where he had multiple problems, but he also had diminished cognitive capacities. And so he wasn't a real good historian, couldn't really communicate that well his issues. But they wanted a referral to a surgeon to see if some of the swelling could be surgically excised or dealt with in some surgical manner. And the surgeon looked at him and said, "Nope, sorry, can't do it." But the patient came along, the student came with the patient. And so the student was able to be a little bit better than the patient was at communicating what was needed. Likewise, when the bad news came back that the surgeon couldn't do anything, the patient became very agitated, really couldn't understand what was going on, and it was the student who was able to do the translation for the patient and therefore help them figure out what the next step would be and how to carry that through. So I got this call from the surgeon who was just amazed at how different the patient interaction was with that particular patient because that student was there, understood the history of the patient, and could follow through. So if that patient had also actually gone into surgery, then the student would go to surgery rounds on that particular patient and hear what the team was doing. If it was an internal medicine gone inpatient, again, the same thing would be true. It's a great way to learn all the different specialties that interact with the patient because they often go with the patient through it. They have what they call their school, which is their tutorial. It is student generated and it comes right out of the cases that they're seeing. So it illustrates beautifully the integration of specialties in care of the patient itself. Now, what if we said that's a great model for the third year? How would that influence how we might design a 4-year curriculum? So let me show you my idea. My suggestion would be that we start with a physical exam boot camp so that 1 month into it, they could at least operate like a medical assistant or an EMT or some basic level of performance. And then they get linked up with that small team of people who are working in that longitudinal clinic experience. They get assigned to one of those teams. And so they begin to do what they can do, which is not much, but that's fine. They can interview, they can take a history, they can do initial physical exams, they can go look things up. They can be the educators in the group. And the learning experience goes back and forth between formally structured learning and that panel of patients. So the team would consist of a first year, second year, third year student, maybe an intern. We've got a pilot that we're going to start at the VA, which is going to take our third year longitudinal experience there and connect it with what's going on in internal medicine residency program. So they will have blocks of inpatient, outpatient, and the students will go with them. So begin thinking about teams, but thinking about it in very different ways, all of which are centered in a panel of patients. So now instead of having to read about paper cases, you have real cases. Instead of having to bring in standardized patients to practice on, you have the real thing. And you spend a fair amount of your time each week in doing that. So we're very excited about that. The other piece of this is the inquiry, discovery, innovation piece. That if you want to inculcate and kind of hardwire innovation thinking into people, then it has to be part of the curriculum. So many schools are doing pathways, the same thing you're doing. That's really good, very important to do. And it ought to be actually part of everything else that's there as well. Is thinking about how do we make things better? How do we think a new thought? And everybody can participate in that. All right, if we bump that up to the next level to residency education, one of the things we need to do is we need to encourage continuously the integration of knowledge as part of the learning process. And I must say that when I was observing those radiology residents, it was striking to me to see how that learning happened and reflected this process. That they would sit down with an attending, they'd read the slides and first look at sort of the anatomical features of what they were doing, bringing that base of knowledge together. And it was also interesting that for the sort of first year residents, that a lot of it was just sort of naming. What is this? How do you describe this? How do we write this up? And later it was sort of fine points in looking at that. But it means connecting all of that formal knowledge with pattern recognition and then the analytic checking with feedback. One of the things that's happening nationally is the integration of residencies and fellowships. I think it's appalling, if you think about it, that I believe that I got the figures right, that an MD, PhD, the average age of an MD, PhD who gets their R01 grant funded is, what do you guess? How old are they? Nope. It's up to 44 now. You're halfway to retirement before you can actually get what you're trying to do. It's absurd. It's unbelievable. So one of the responses to that, along with the sort of explosion of knowledge and subspecialization, is to say, you know what? We gotta think a new thought, and we have to core back and think about a smaller core and provide earlier specialization. So in medicine, you're seeing people advocating for a 2+1. So you take two years core. The third year, you could be a general internist if that's what you want, or a hospitalist, but you could also go right into fellowship, and since 70+% do, you just shaved a year off of that. Bravo. The same is true in radiology. They're thinking about a 3 and 2 combination. Surgery is thinking about a 3 and 2. Most specialties are saying, we've got to cut the time down. And they're beginning to think about ways to connect UME and GME. So one of our emphasis is what we're calling our Pathways to Discovery program, which can start with year 1, can move on through into faculty positions, and you can flexibly enter this program at any level, and you can get a master's degree as part of that process if you choose. And by virtue of having experience and succeeding at that at the UME level, it shaves time off and guarantees a slot in a GME program. So we've got to think about across the barriers in new ways that speed things up. And finally, we need to focus on the capacities and the abilities to do leadership, discovery, advocacy, and quality improvement. Okay, second theme. The rest of these are going to go much faster. Get carried away with this one, but we'll move faster on it. So one of the key things that we know about ourselves, about our children, about our grandchildren, if you're my age, is that everybody is different. Every single person is different. Now, the cognitive processes of learning are the same, but what you bring to it, how you traverse through it, how you get to the other side is always unique. And we need to do a better job of acknowledging and recognizing those differences in our learners that come to us with amazing backgrounds, amazing expertise. In fact, it reminds me that every year when I ask the first day of orientation, I usually have hands go up. How many of you have a PhD? How many of you have a master's degree? How many of you are health professionals? It's amazing how many people have done wonderful things. And yet we treat them all the same. We need multiple paths to recognize that people take different routes to learning and reasoning. And what's clear from the evidence too is that people attend to different things, they ignore different things, and they engage with different intensity in different ways. That's all individually determined and driven. And obviously they achieve mastery at different rates and in different areas. The other interesting piece is that part of what happens when you are part of a learning community, or any community for that matter, is that how you engage with it is, again, individually determined. And so what you get out of it is totally different. I'm reminded of a luncheon. I give luncheons for students routinely so I can sort of hear their stories. And in last summer, I had one with third years, end of third years. No, it was beginning of third years. And as we went around and asked them where they had done their first set of rotations, 2 of them had been down at Fresno. And the first one said, oh, it's a fantastic experience. I got to do all this stuff. And the second one said, it was a terrible experience. I had to do all this stuff, saying the same thing. And that's just so classic of how people respond in different ways to the same experience in a community of practice. So one of the things that has been really transformative to us as a research team is a whole new body of research that I was actually not aware of at all, called workplace learning. And it's quite different than adult learning theory, which in my book is a pile of, well, you know, it's that other stuff. Not empirically driven, not helpful, and mostly opinion. This, on the other hand, is driven not by avocational learning, but rather by workplace learning. And Billett's book is really exceptional. These are 2 wonderful articles. But what they take as an acting premise is that one learns in a work environment, not by books, but by experience. And that the key is the level of participation in the tasks and activities of that community. And so you can think about it as starting on very much on the peripheral, doing really minor things, but observing what's going on, till you are at the point where you are actually leading and doing. So that curriculum, in a sense, is the set of cases, the tasks, the experience of the work community. And
Call this an apprenticeship?
well, some of it, yes. Except more of a cognitive apprenticeship, I would say, than the classic one. But this is influenced by three things: by task relationships and the structure of the work itself. So let's look at that. One of the key things about this is that the key task of the teacher or the master is lining out the tasks that the learner will participate in. And that means defining the level of responsibility, and not just at orientation day. It is in relation to this particular task, what do I expect you to do? It is sequencing those from relatively easy to complex, and it requires, in order to do that, continuity. And that's the problem with our constant churning that is our current clerkship structure. There is total discontinuity on absolutely every level. And faculty are the last to observe it, I might add, but students will tell you about it with great clarity. The second piece of learning in this environment is that it's dependent on the nature of the relationships amongst the people who work and participate in that. And some groups have what is termed an invitational quality. They welcome learners to it, and some people say, you're a pain in the butt, I'm busy, I don't want to deal with you, shut up, stand in the corner, watch, if you get something out, great, but I'm too busy to deal with you. Okay? Totally different experiences. Second is that if you want people to risk and to grow and to work at the highest edge of their capacities, then they have to be supported in that, and they have to know there's somebody there to catch them if they screw up. And that requires appropriate mentorship and apprenticeship. And finally, their capacity to gain from that is determined in large measure by them. It's back to the student who didn't get anything and somebody who did. So all of those are true, and they all contribute to the relationship. And the final piece of this structure that connects with participation is the work practices itself. Namely, how much time pressure is there? What's the workload of the group? It absolutely determines how much time you've got to teach and work in these environments. And how does the work get structured, and what's the hierarchy, and who does what? All of that has to be understood by the learners. In fact, we were talking about some funny stories about students showing up and nobody being there and thinking, oh well, I'll go home. Wrong. They're all in delivering the baby and you should have been there earlier. Okay, so all of this influences how learning occurs, and it's all a combination of both the group and the individual. So what are some strategies for individualizing things? Well, the first thing is that we have to work better, we have to work smarter at sequencing and guiding learning. And that's why it has to be longitudinal. It really should be longitudinal from day one on through, and it ought to include individual learning plans and portfolios and reflections on that. Second thing is we've got to shrink the curriculum. You can't just keep stuffing more in, which means you have to think more about how you integrate and the conceptual integration of that, not just a gazillion sets of facts and information. And the way we can do that is by reclaiming time, because of the ability to determine when somebody has mastered what we expect them to do. The problem with the current system is it's set up as a safety net for the slowest person. And since everybody goes through lockstep, most people get through, but we haven't got a clue as to how many times they actually need to do something. When we were at the University of Southern Illinois and looking at surgical education, one of their issues was, I can't remember which procedure they were looking at, but the question was, how many times do you need to do the procedure in order to become competent and therefore be able to move on? And they concluded it was about 35 times. Gave you pretty good routine expertise with a little bit of adaptive expertise. They were doing 150 of them, and thus not getting to the more complex ones which they needed, all being driven by service, of course, rather than learning. So we have lots of room in the system if we use it smarter. And we need to offer electives, areas of specialization where students and residents are able to concentrate on something in depth and develop the scholarly habits of mind for asking the tough questions, engaging in inquiry and discovery to advance the field. And I don't mean that just in the sense of bench research. I mean that in the sense of improving the flow of the practice. I mean in communicating with patients. I mean every single dimension that we can think of. How do we, on a daily basis, improve the quality of what we do and have that built into us, hardwired? Which, of course, leads us exactly into this third point, which is insistence upon excellence. One of the things that we want is we want a sort of ongoing commitment to develop not just routine expertise, not knowing what to do when it always comes up the same way, but to be able to be adaptive experts, to know what happens when it's confusing, when it's gray, when it's overlapping, when nothing makes sense. And that means that we need learners who are in the mode of learning continuously because they have a lifetime of practice. And from Erickson's work on deliberate practice, sort of regardless of field, he figures it takes about 10,000 hours of practice, which explains why when I spurted up in junior high and wanted to play basketball without ever practicing, that I was so bad. You need lots and lots of practice. And the way in which you get better is not just by practice. It is by being very deliberate about advancing your knowledge and skills as part of that process. And that's what Brighter and Scardomalia and Surpassing Ourselves write about in terms of the fact that there's a difference between experts and experienced non-experts, or between grandmaster chess players and you and me. And it is, in part, the fact that they continuously work on improving the quality of what they do, relentlessly. And that the best place to do that is in the context of a community that works continuously on knowledge building. Thus, the university. But I have to say, it's not just the university. There are lots and lots of practices that are devoted to quality improvement, and in fact are doing much better than we are at being able to do that. So it's being immersed in a community of practice that values, affirms, and as part of their everyday practice is always asking the question, how can we do this better? How can we think a new thought about what we're doing? So what are we doing? You might remember some of these characters. The first thing we need to do is we need to reframe how we think about what is a physician. It is not just a clinician. It is also an innovator, a pathfinder, a field builder. And as part of that process, what we know from medical education, but also from education generally, is that if you want people to do that, then you have to immerse them in the messiness of the issues of the practice. Where are the contested areas? Where do people disagree? Violently disagree oftentimes. And that's exactly the point you want to get them engaged. And you want to immerse them in a discovery process so that they take ownership, they begin to sense the importance of wrestling with those things, and they understand what scholarship is all about. And on the GME and obviously the practice-based learning and systems-based practice are two of the ACGME competencies which are aimed directly at this particular issue, which is how do I improve what I'm doing, how do I reflect on what I'm doing, how do I evaluate it, and therefore how do I make it better. And finally, the fourth one is identity formation, that we are about shaping the lives of future physicians. We want them to take on the professional identity, behaviors, and aspirations, and the moral commitments to do what is right on behalf of patients and to serve their needs to the best of their ability. So we do that through learning in practice communities. We do it, and they learn it by observing role models and team interactions. There's a lot of stuff written about the hidden curriculum, right, Clarence? Hidden curriculum and how it actually corrupts. And so if you look at the empathy factors and other things that we preach about and want people to adopt, they actually go the other way. The more experience they have in it, the more distant they become. So we need to find ways to address that and to work at creating more positive models and taking seriously that it really is the practice environment that shapes that most powerfully, and therefore we need to work on that.
Is this largely what we call professionalism?
Yes, it is. Yep. And teaching directly to it, coaching, and assessment is all part of that. So how are we seeing people working on this? Formal instruction is certainly one way. People have their ethics courses, they have their professionalism courses, and certainly that's important. I would say it's the least important of all of these, but it is important to hold up so that it reflects the values of the community in the formal instruction that's there. Honor codes and pledges are typical of what we see, as well as white coat ceremonies. Two illustrations here. One is that probably the place that's done more on this than any place to transform the culture of the institution is at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston. Jack Stobo's worked down there for, I think, about a dozen years. Professionalism was his prime reason for being. And every employee, every trainee, every faculty member in there has to sign the pledge, which says something to the effect, on my honor, as a member of the UTMB community, I solemnly pledge to treat everyone with respect, compassion, and integrity as part of my academic and professional activities. Every single person through there. And he's cut down the turnover rate on the nursing staff. He's made that institution the highest rated in terms of the place we'd like to work at, the best to work at. Although I have to say, as he would say and did say to us, I haven't cracked the faculty and the residents yet, but we're working on that. Another interesting approach, and the place where culture really shines, is Mayo. How many of you have ever been to Mayo? It is something unto itself up there in the prairies. But the reason we chose to go there was because it's not embedded in a university. It's one of the few medical schools that is not. It's embedded in a healthcare system. And the number one value is treat the patient comes first. Every time. And so we thought, well, how can that be any good for education? Where's education in all this? Well, as it turns out, it's a great place for education. And we saw illustration after illustration of how that played out in terms of when they found people violating that. Somebody not wanting to have a patient turf to them. And, well, was that the best thing for the patient? Well, no, okay. And lots of stories about the heroes, the old Mayo brothers, still live on right into the sunset. It's all part of that symbolism, storytelling dimension of the culture, which focuses on the patient first. The buildings are amazing. Well, clearly, especially in the wintertime. I tell you, I don't know how they do it. Now, what's really funny, though, is, for those of you who haven't been to Mayo, they don't wear white coats because that's sort of dirty, I suppose. I don't know. They wear suits. Everybody wears suits. And Men's Warehouse has a special Mayo section of acceptable men's suits. Very different culture. We saw one guy who was protesting because he was wearing a turtleneck. He thought that was really cool. Okay. Anyway, strong culture, for better or for ill. Second thing is enacting the values within the practice community. And I want to share two different examples here. One is the approach to appreciative inquiry, which of course David would love, which focuses on identifying, telling stories, sharing stories about the best of who we are. And Indiana University is doing that better than anybody else around. The flip side of it is to say, you know what? Almost everybody does a great job. 98% of our faculty residents have integrity, are compassionate, respectful of each other. It's the 2% that cause all the problems. So at UCSF, we took the bottom feeder approach. We said, the problem is, how do you deal with the outliers who constantly screw up the education for our students and our residents? And so we just added 2 items on the student and resident rating forms of teachers. And the items were, treats me with respect, treats others with respect. If somebody gets a rating of a 1, 2, or 3 on a 5-point scale, then that gets automatically sent to Maxine Papadakis, who is our Associate Dean for Student Affairs. And if they begin to pile up, so it's a clear pattern, as is typically the case, then she does an administrative intervention. First trying to work with the faculty member. If that doesn't work, as it usually doesn't, then you go to the department chair, and the department chair chews on them. And it took us about 3 years to turn around a whole division, actually. I'm sure you would know where that was, but do not tell. And they now have great ratings. They really do. So you can take either the top or the bottom, but the hardest thing is to get administrative will to do anything, period. So that's critical. All right, finally, assessment, reflection, feedback are important, both formal and informal, and I'm going to skip on for that one. So what were our 4 big ideas? First was integration. The importance of integrating different forms of knowledge, different forms of reasoning, different roles in the profession of medicine. And then to think about individualization, adding a particular capacity, a particular focus, a particular way through the environment that adds to what they are able to do. That's overlaid with an absolute hardwired commitment to excellence, and that results in an identity that forms the physician of the future that we expect. So, what would Flexner think? Let's go back to where we started. He said, let's think like a scientist. That's actually not a bad adage, it's just inadequate. Learn actively and deeply. We certainly would concur with that. And be immersed in a learning community, namely a university and a teaching hospital, which I think is a bit more challenging today than it was then. And we're saying, again, integration is critical, individualization, insistence on excellence, to think like a physician scientist, actually, combination of both of those, and to enact and live out the values of the profession. So personally, I think Flexner would think this is great. And since he's not here to disagree with me, I can claim anything I want on that. So in conclusion, what I would say is that the future that we are trying to create, and which we want to see the formation of physicians to become, is that we want to integrate and balance formal knowledge and clinical experience, to offer individual pathways through the learning process and into practice, that we want to engage the learners in the pursuit of excellence, and that as a result of all that, we want to shape the hearts, the minds, and the souls of our future practitioners. Thank you.
to open it up to questions right now, so feel free to just ask David any questions you have in mind. I have a couple myself, but Clarence, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Dave, for a great summary of the work you've been doing. It's really fabulous and very inspiring to think about. When you were talking about individualization, excuse me, individualization, I thought you were going to talk about some of the interest in a competency-based approach in some schools that have basically said, we don't care how you get there. Here are the competencies that you need to complete. Some have
Right.
even had different number in this column.
Yeah.
Can
Minnesota
you comment
being-
a little bit, a little bit more on that?
Yes, and in fact, if I had more time to illustrate it, I would have picked Minnesota as an example of that, which basically says you pay for 4 years, you can get out of here in 3 if you want, you just have to meet the benchmarks and the performance, or you can stay longer if you want. I think that's exactly the right way to go, and that was what I was hinting at with the surgery example, which is let's try and figure the best we can at what is essential to learn, and then let's hone in on it, make sure people get it, and then let them specialize in other areas. So, yeah, thank you.
If you take societal perspective, which says that we're turning out too many specialists anyhow, we need more generalists, that the parts don't work with one another, and they're looking at economic gain and sub-optimization for the whole because they're optimized for. I don't hear in the examples of integration something beyond the medicine box. And in fact, if we really take the challenge society is giving us, we need to be integrative even on a broader scale than what you mentioned. Do you have any thoughts about that?
You're absolutely right. The challenge of specialization is that atomized approach to the world, no question about it. You can think about that from our perspective from a couple of different points. One is the integration theme, and I'll actually flag that as a point to think about. The other place is in terms of specialization in the opposite sense in which you would imagine it, because you can specialize in being a generalist. It's sort of like the quantitative sciences are beginning to be used in epidemiology much more because you need that sort of scope or span. And certainly in areas of concentration, one of those, at least at UCSF, is in public policy and advocacy and health disparities in a variety of other areas that are actually aimed at exactly those issues for which we need system changes. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Veronica?
Thanks so much.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you again. So a lot of this work, which is wonderful, appears to be happening, as I would imagine it would, more at the medical student level, and some of it sort of filtering into the residency level. I wonder if you could comment on that a bit more, because in my cohort of training colleagues, residency to some degree becomes a black hole for many of these things. You sort of disappear into the work of the hospital or the clinic, and in some ways rightly so, the immersion process needs to happen, but I particularly liked your notion of time saving by figuring out achievement of competency in a particular domain and having more time to do some of these longitudinal, multi-domain learning processes that begin in medical school and seem to abruptly come to a halt when you hit residency.
Yeah.
So thoughts on that?
Oh, totally. Couldn't agree more. Absolutely agree. In fact, it was striking to us when we went around the country that with if you look historically at medical education, UME has innovated way longer, invested way more money, in part because it's a different ownership model. The curriculum is owned by the dean's office. It's owned centrally. And while it has sort of given up much of its responsibility when it was departmentally run, still the resources are there and the focus is there, and therefore the likelihood of having more critical mass is there than each individual department has as part of its old-fashioned apprenticeship, which is throw them in, hope they make it. At the end, we'll say, go to it, and if they pass, they're fine. Repeatedly, we heard residents say exactly what you said, which is, I had all this great experience. I wanted to continue working on some things, and it's just a black hole. It's just, in fact, really black. Terribly, terribly, no light on in the place. And the part of that is driven by the RRCs, and, which is really, again, driven mostly by the bottom. And so if you say we need a minimal threshold for a program to run, and since faculty, particularly in community programs, are amazingly resistant to doing anything, then we will tell you exactly how many hours you have to be here and how many hours you have to be there. And as a result, the net result of it is it's totally constraining, totally constraining. And then you add the perturbations of the particular healthcare system you're in, and it's a disaster. So the good news is that I think nationally people are beginning to recognize that, and so the educational innovation projects that internal medicine has started are now beginning to get picked up in other specialties. And there's beginning to be more willingness to say, okay, if you meet bottom threshold, then let's give you more autonomy to think creatively about how to do that. But I really think GME is still the wasteland.
Following that directly, how much of that is the way money is distributed for GME?
Well, it's an interesting issue. And if I could sort of back out to a larger view, I have a chapter in the book on financing of medical education. I happen to be of the belief, and I may be wrong, but I think there's reasonable evidence, that actually there's plenty of money in the system for medical education, for UME and GME, both of them. The problem is it doesn't get used for that, okay? So the feds send it to the hospital, and the hospital says, oh, great, we need a new MRI. That's where it goes. Do residency program director time get bought out the way it's supposed to? No, not in many systems. And funding for UME, exactly the same situation. I get from student fees, $8 million a year theoretically comes through. I get 2 of that. The rest of it goes to other institutional missions, okay? So bottom line is there money? Yeah, there's lots of money. Is it used appropriately? No, it is not. There are a number of places that have done some very, very creative work in that capacity in partnering between the educational focus and the departments and school on the one hand and the medical centers on the other. So Michigan would be an example, Penn is another example, Florida is another example. And at Michigan, they got, I don't know how they got it, but they got a huge, huge multi-million-dollar bolus gift that goes into an innovation fund.
You have to add money, you can't redistribute it.
And so, you know, it's like our Academy of Medical Educators. Faculty can apply for these grants and buys out time, and they can actually innovate and do things. And I think that's what is required in order to do that. Brian, let's see, no, you, yeah.
Thank you, David. The forward-looking plan that you had is time constrained, and we're just talking money constraints too. I expected you to mention the use of experiential technologies, like virtual patients, to gain experience as an intermediate. And this model comes from the workplace, from the airline, which is a major component, which is quite a different scenario. But the point is that there are technologies. In fact, the AAMC now has, with the MedEd portal, virtual patients for students to gain the experience that we want them to have when they get to the clinic. And they have it under their belt, so to speak, before they get there. And one of the problems that we're having, isn't it, that patients are resisting coming to medical schools to be practiced on by students. It's a fear. It's a palpable fear. And so it seems to me that one way to counterbalance that fear on the one hand and give experience to our students to be prepared is the use of educational technology.
Absolutely. I went an hour and 10 on this thing, so I trimmed all sorts of stuff out, and that's one of them. But simulations, virtual reality, and virtual patients, we have to essentially offload a lot of what we would normally have developed expertise around in the context of practice into these other environments. So simulation centers, virtual patients are certainly the technology that is there and will be needed. So, yes?
I just wanted to take a little bit of a step back. I'm interested in your thoughts. I'm curious about how some of these ideas that you're talking about, particularly in terms of longitudinal learning, self-directed learning, how that might affect our admissions process, what the requirements would be to get into medical school, what our selection process would be, and if that would be any different in your mind than what the current model is.
Can I add whether you stay in medical school?
What was that?
Whether you stay in medical school,
Oh, whether you...
European model as opposed to the American model?
Oh, yeah, okay. First of all, I would say that we did not look at the admissions process. If you think of our study, for the most part, we started at the clerkships. We also looked at the foundations of patient care, the doctoring courses in the first 2 years, but that was it. So we didn't get back at the front end of this. We may, as before we wind up, put something in on admissions. Certainly, if we're wanting people who are creative, adaptive, then we need to select for those issues. And is chemistry required for that? Probably not, but you do need some scientific basis. I mean, you certainly need statistics, which isn't required, but should be required. So, yeah, there are some tweaking kind of things. And there's some very interesting work, mostly coming out of McMaster University, of different models of how to do admissions selection processes that look more like an objective structured clinical exam in a short period of time with a core of people who do those interviews. So there are some very interesting models out there that are beginning to be adapted and used. Regarding staying in school or throwing out, my personal bias is that if you do a reasonably good job of the selection process, then we ought to do as much as we can to help people succeed while they're there. The average dropout rate in medical school is probably about 2 to 3%. In my experience, you know, it's probably on average, we probably dismiss 1 student a year at UCSF. And I'd say we're an outlier on that score because most schools won't do it. They just won't go to that problem. And the real problem is that for people who can't make it, they invest 6, 7 years before you finally say, we've had enough and you've had enough, go do something else. And now they've got $200,000 in debt. It's not fair to them. So I would be a fairly strong proponent of back to competency assessment, but also providing as much support services as we can. Yeah?
I really enjoyed the presentation and the 4 points, the big ideas, but of the 4, 3 of them are ones I don't think there's going to be tremendous controversy about, the striving for excellence and individualization and the identity formation. Those are great. The one where I think there is controversy is the part about integration, the best ways to get there. And I think if you mentioned this in your discussion that your faculty would be in an uproar, and I think the resistance comes in part because of the enormous energy that it would take to get there, and then the concern that how do you know at the end of the day that what you're doing is better? And going forward, I think if there were data from Harvard or somewhere else that said, gee, we compared and we did this critically and we now have evidence, which everyone's looking for, that doing it in this longitudinal integrated model is better, I think there would be more buy-in from faculty and such. So my question to you is...
You really think so?
It might be, but how do you assess the outcome, given how complex the the challenge is? How do you assess the outcome of a Cambridge program or other programs to try to drive, with evidence, faculty to look at this as a better or a different model worth exploring?
Yeah. Well, we are in an evidence-based environment, which is a good thing on the whole. What we've seen from curriculum reform nationally, if you look at the first 2 years, so let me start there and then we'll go to Cambridge. Our experience at UCSF, I'm sure it was the same as yours, and every other school I talked to before we went through it was, if you look at step 1 of the boards, there's very little movement. There's a little bit uptick, which was true for us, but not a huge difference. So then you say, well, why go to all this work? Well, because there are other important things that we want to see. One of which is, do faculty and students find this a better learning environment in which to live? And what we know from the prior one was it was a hellacious one. It was terrible. And back to the issue of should I stay in or not, a lot of people said if this is what it's about, I don't even want to be here. So I do think that there is a lot to the process that one goes through on that. The second thing is that if you want people to be able to retain it and use it, then you have to learn it in the context of later use. And you have to use it multiple times in adaptive ways in different capacities. And there's beginning to be some reasonable research to suggest that that in fact is true. Now, related to the reason I was smirking on the Cambridge is that there is some very nice data. And it follows basically what we just found, which is, A, if you look at step 2 results, they're better, but they aren't hugely better. But if you look at the learning that they're doing, if you look at the integration they're doing, if you look at the mentoring that they're getting, if you look at satisfaction, both with them and with their patients, it's immensely better. It's doing exactly what the program asked for. Now, does that convince anybody? It didn't convince colleagues at Harvard. And we essentially decided to do it even though we didn't have any data. So if you go back to the third point about innovation and excellence, the reason you do research is because you don't know if one's better than the other to begin with. You can't. It's impossible. And that's the challenge in convincing our colleagues to go along with this humongous investment in planning and change and effort on it, because what's the evidence? Well, you can't know the evidence in advance. And that's the challenge in making the argument. Yeah.
Do you have enough evidence from enough time in the Cambridge experience to look at the matching data and see whether we're changing the scope of individualization? Are we shooting towards the National Health Insurance model with a lot more people in family medicine? How does this influence the career course that the students choose once they finish this career?
They're all over the map, as they would expect to be. So I think they've done it for about 3 or 4 years now. And in fact, we've got quite a few of them at UCSF in residency programs, and I've talked to a number of them. The intent was never to shift one direction or another. The intent was to create better doctors and to create, even more importantly, a better learning experience for them. And all of their data from my perspective, looks really good. And in a different talk, I would have shown you the data, but too short.
So we have a couple minutes left and we'll close, but I want to get your reflections on how you would evaluate. What are the ideas about evaluating both the curricular aspect and, of course, the students in this regard, with something in the back of your mind, which is that we don't have grades, of course, just as something as a backdrop. But what are your reflections on what angle you have on evaluating all this?
I'd want to look at it I'd probably cluster it according to the big ideas, go for the end in mind, and then try to do as multiple ways of looking at it as possible, but in line with the rationale, which is why are we doing this? So what's the learning theory tell us should be going on, should guide us in terms of trying to think about how to do an inquiry related to it. It's a great question. I'll count on you to help us out.
Fair enough, no problem. Happy to do it. I want to thank, because we're running out of time, but thanks everybody for coming, appreciate it. Thank you very much.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.